Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today, I'm going to talk about the closing arguments and the verdict in the Stauch trial, and hopefully I can do it justice. So let's talk about that down at the beach. I sometimes think back to 1963, November of 1963 to be specific. I was in third grade, and I was in Mrs. Hayes' class at Sacred Heart in Sedalia, Missouri. And one of the African American janitors came running into the classroom and announced that President Kennedy had been shot. And within a few minutes, the classes were dismissed and we were all sent home. And I remember the entire nation being in shock. And then later, watching Walter Cronkite go through the news, taking off his glasses and saying what happened. And I've often thought, you know, if I could have, if I'd been Walter Cronkite, I would have wanted to be anywhere else when that happened, because I would not have wanted to have broken that news to a nation. So I guess I feel a little bit like Walter Cronkite must have felt on that day, because the last thing in the world anybody wants to do is talk about the death of a child, and particularly the death of Gannon Stauch. That death is so heinous and the outcome so awful that it even after having watched parts of that trial, I can't wrap my head around it. I had 3 children and I loved them all very dearly, and I would never have harmed any of them. And I can't imagine what kind of mind allows you to first kill a child and then second stuff his body into a suitcase. That must have been, the mind must have truly been deranged or exceptionally evil. Well, today we have a verdict in that case, and I want to talk a little bit about the closing arguments. So let's cut into a couple of segments of the closing argument and let's see if we can get a grasp of what's going on.
At this point in time, we will start with the prosecution's closing argument. Prosecution?
Thanks, Judge. Morning. Been a long trial. You guys have sat through a lot of evidence, and you're going to have to sift through that evidence and sift through the instructions, kind of what we talked about when we're selecting you, and apply the facts of this case to the law that you now have been given. Before I start my closing, I want to just say thank you for that. You guys have been very attentive. I can see that every day. You've asked some very good questions that I'm actually going to use in my closing argument as I go forward here. One of the things about a homicide case that is true and to form in pretty much every homicide case I've done in my career is the case kind of evolves to talk about the defendant. We spend a lot of time talking about the defendant. And then when you add that the defense is insanity, you even spend more time talking about the defendant. I want to come back to Gannon in a little bit. Gannon's been in a box back here for the whole trial. This is what the trial should be about. And I'm not doing this to get sympathy from you. I'm doing this to tell you that what Gannon had to tell you in this trial through the autopsy, all you need to know. And when the defendant did what she did to him, saying at the time she did it.
So the prosecutor's opening here, I think, has been absolutely marvelous. You start out by reminding the people who the real victim is here, because for 21 days they've talked about somebody who's not the real victim. They've talked about Letitia Stauch. She's not the real victim. The real victim is Gannon. And it's important for the prosecutor to point that out. And I think he's done a really good job here. He's like, I don't want sympathy for the child. I want you to pay attention to what he told you in the autopsy. Now, that is a very good way of framing the issue rhetorically, because he is there, the prosecutor is there to speak for Gannon. No one else can speak for Gannon in this case except for the prosecutor. And the prosecutor gets up there and speaks for him and says, listen to what he told you. That is masterful work on the part of the prosecutor here.
Body wasn't found in Florida. Do you think we'd be talking about insanity in this file? It's a pure fact of divine intervention that Macon Ponder happened to be searching that bridge when he did. Remember, he said he searched that bridge every 2 years. Just so happened on March 17th, 2020, out there searching that bridge and he saw that suitcase. Dr. Lewis says it was crazy to drive a suitcase across the country and dump it over a bridge in Florida. Was it really? Think about the divine intervention of Gannon's body even being found to get here to where we're at right now. And the effort and determination that she took to hide his body. We're going to talk about that quite a bit more as I go through my closing.
Moment here, he's going to talk about some of the jury instructions, but right now what he's doing is he is setting up the idea that people do not take steps to conceal a crime if they don't know that it's wrong. That's common sense, and the defense knows that. But what else does the defense have to play? What other card do they have to play rationally other than the she's crazy in the head card? And that's what they're doing. They're playing that, and they're trying very hard to get that message across. The only problem for them is that there are so many facts that stack up in this case, particularly that fact, the idea that she drove the body to Florida, about as far away from Colorado as you can get in a linear direction, and threw it off of a bridge. Nobody does that if they don't want to hide the body. And the only reason to hide the body is if you know that what you've done is very, very wrong.
First of all, I'm going to start at the bottom. It says the law presumes everyone to be sane. There's a presumption of sanity. However, after some evidence of insanity has been presented, the burden of proof shifts to us, and we gladly accept it. Gladly accept it. Now, what does insanity mean? The defendant was insane at the time of the commission of the acts if he was so diseased or defective in mind at the time of the commission of the act as to be incapable of distinguishing right from wrong with respect to the act. That's why you heard me ask that question so many times. Or she suffered from a condition of mind caused by a mental disease or defect that prevented her from forming a culpable mental state, the ones we just talked about, that is an essential element of a crime charged. And then the next paragraph means something, because it says, but care should be taken not to confuse mental disease or defect with moral obliquity, mental depravity, or passion growing out of anger. Passion growing out of anger. If you lose your temper, you don't get to claim insanity. Revenge, hatred, or other motives and kindred evil conditions, because when an act is induced by any of these causes, the person is accountable to the law. So you can't lose your temper and come in and say, I lost my temper, I wasn't myself. We're humans. We have emotions. The next part is what's critical. It says, in addition, disease or defective in mind does not refer to an abnormality manifested by only repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. We heard a little bit about antisocial personality disorder. Who hasn't been diagnosed with that, but that's the reason why someone who has antisocial personality disorder, they have fun killing people, they lie all the time, they manipulate all the time, they have no empathy, they have no sympathy. Those people don't get to come in and say, I was legally insane.
This is where I think the prosecutor put a nail sort of in the coffin of the defense case. He's talking about how when you lose your temper, you don't get to claim that you were nuts. That for whatever reason, if you lose your temper, you just lost your temper and you acted out of rage. That doesn't mean you didn't appreciate the wrongfulness of your conduct. To me, it would be pretty hard for someone to hold a knife in their hand and stab a small child and not appreciate the wrongfulness of that conduct. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but to me, it seems pretty obvious that you can't really claim that you are sick in the head if all you are is just an angry, vindictive, vengeful woman who hates a child. And I think that's where we were at here.
What I'd like to talk about is what people who are truly legally insane do under these circumstances. Because there are people who are truly legally insane, ladies and gentlemen. They don't act like that. If they don't have the capacity to know right from wrong, they're not going to hide the body. They're going to act like nothing happened. They may even do the crime if someone's there watching them because they don't know that it's wrong. Do you think she would have done this to Gannon if anyone was in the room with her?
Well, I think this was a masterful closing, and I think he ended it on the right note, asking basically, do you think that we'd be here discussing the insanity defense, basically if she hadn't hidden the body? And also, do you think that she really acted like somebody who didn't appreciate the wrongfulness of her conduct because everything that she did afterwards was oriented toward not being found out? I would give him an A+ on this. I think he did a terrific job. And that's even in view of the fact that the video and the audio in this trial has been absolutely horrendous. But I think he did as good a job as it's possible to do. I thought his original examination of the dad was very good. And I thought the evidence came in very favorable to the prosecution. And of course, the defense didn't challenge the fact that she was, in fact, the killer. Now let's take a look at the defense closing argument. It isn't being done by the lawyer who initially opened the case. It's being done by the other lawyer, and I think there is pretty good reason for that. I think this gentleman does as good a job as he can possibly do in this case. Let's listen.
There you go. The one thing they cannot answer, because there is no answer, is motive. Motive for why this happened. Motive how we can go from this picture on a hike up at Garden of the Gods, loving, kind, to less than 24 hours later. Brutal rage, 18 stab wounds, 4 blunt force trauma, shot. This wasn't a pre-planned, calculated killing for some gain. This was a psychotic break fueled by rage, attacking a demon from the past. They cannot come up with a motive because there is no motive that makes sense, ladies and gentlemen. They have tried. They have spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours trying to come up with one. They've gone through phones. They have gone through iCloud accounts. They have gone through Facebook messages. They've interviewed everybody who they could possibly think of to try to find some motive. None of what they have done in this, the biggest investigation in the history of El Paso County, has come up with a motive. No one who they have ever interviewed has ever said that she ever had a problem with Gannon. No one who they have ever interviewed has ever said she was ever mean to Gannon. No one who they've ever interviewed or come across anything that says she's ever done anything wrong to Gannon until that horrible day when this happens. That is the evidence, and the most strong evidence to know this was not premeditated murder. This was a psychotic break. That is the only thing that makes sense. And when you can pull yourself back and peel back the layers of the anger over the act, at the anger over the deceit in which it happened, at the anger over Gannon's body being driven all the way to Florida, when we take those emotions back and we try to look at this rationally, the only thing that possibly makes sense is a psychotic break.
So out of the gate, I think he does an excellent job by going directly to motive. There's no motive here. No history of animus between the parties, no history of her being mean to Gannon, none of these things. And that indicates that it must be something other than hatred or, anger or something like that. I understand what he's doing here. I think he was smart to start that way. But you have to remember the prosecution does not have to prove motive. They don't have to prove motive at all. They only have to prove that it is not, they basically have to prove that she was capable of understanding what she did. Uh, and as a result of that, I think that sort of starting with motive is something that's going to be easily defended by the prosecution in their rebuttal. And then as he goes through this, then the other thing that he does is he gets to the end and he says, look, the only possibility here is that she had a psychotic break. Well, logically, that's incorrect. That is certainly a possibility, and that's certainly something he should have said. He should have said, it is certainly a possibility that she had a psychological break, that she broke down, that she had some kind of psychosis that manifested itself in a sudden fit of craziness. But he didn't do that. What he said is it's the only possibility. It is possible to lead a horse to water, but then when you get that horse to water, tell him that the water's poisoned. And that's exactly what he's done here. He's led them up the path to it's a possibility, and he goes one step too far and says it's the only possibility. And I think when he does that, he sort of poisons the well. But again, what else does he have? He doesn't have anything else to go with other than she's crazy. And he's doing what he can to get the result that he believes is in her best interest. And I'm sure he does believe that putting her in an insane asylum is the best for her. It's probably not the best for society, however.
But we have her starting meltdown. Meltdown right after this fire. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lewis used the term wacky a lot, maybe not the most scientific term, but when something seems irrational, when something doesn't seem to make sense, we have to consider mental illness. We have to consider possible psychosis. I would say that video that you heard up there, listen to the tenor of her voice, listen to what she is saying. She says, I'm freaked out. And when you listen to her voice, she is freaked out. And she's saying irrational stuff like, we're going to have to sell the sofa. Stuff like that to Gannon. That makes no sense there whatsoever. And then importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we also see mania starting to settle in when we start looking at these timelines specifically. Be up there, they're texting back and forth, 10:15, Harley comes home, 10:24, 11:30, she's still talking to Al. 2:48, she's texting Al. 4:36, texting the school saying that her stepfather passed away. Her stepfather who had abused her was not, and you heard it from Dr. Torres at the state hospital, they are not doubting or disputing the abuse that she suffered growing up. And that's from Dr. Torres, who had investigated this, who had medical record provided, who had family members provided, who interviewed other family members, and she says the state hospital is not disputing the horrible trauma that she grew up with. And the person who she had suffered that horrible trauma from, that's who she calls and says dies at 4:36 in the morning. What is more important by this, ladies and gentlemen, important to look at, what is also that we see, what is she not doing? She's not sleeping. She is manic at this point in time. She is texting throughout the night, 2:48, 4:36, 4:36 again, 5:03, 5:49, 7:32. She is up the entire night and not sleeping. There is something going on with her head that is not seeming right.
Now, he does a pretty workmanlike job of getting through all of the text evidence to show that in the hours after the crime was likely committed, she was in a manic phase and she was up all night. She was, apparently all conflicted because somebody who abused her had supposedly died, even though we know that's not the case. There are all sorts of indications here that she is acting irrationally. But I think a reasonable juror in this situation looks at that timeline and all that texting activity and all of her manic behavior and says, yeah, I'm pretty sure that if I had killed a child, I would not be able to sleep. And I'm pretty sure I'd do anything in the world I could to take my mind off of that. So I'm not sure he really helped her case at that point with this, you know, run through the evidence of her manic episode following the murder. I don't think that that helped because it doesn't really go to the mental state prior to the actual killing. It's the mental state prior to the actual killing and not the mental state after the killing that actually matters here. And so I think when we get to the last little bit of his closing here, you'll see him do as good a job as he can to try and bring this home. And I know now, of course, that it wasn't quite enough. Let's watch.
And ladies and gentlemen, I would put before you with all the different doctors diagnosing with some serious mental health illness, with their witnesses they called diagnosing with a mental illness that has transient periods of psychosis, when psychosis appearing to be the only rational explanation, when no other motive for this horrible thing, with the overkill that was involved here, with the irrational behavior afterwards, even up and through some of these interviews, even up through some of the trial, all of that points to mental illness.
And of course, now we know exactly how this turned out. And let's listen to the verdicts here.
With respect to count number 1, charge of murder in the first degree after deliberation, we, the jury, find the defendant Letitia Stauch guilty of count number 1, murder in the first degree after deliberation. With respect to count number 2, charge of murder in the first degree, child under 12 by a person in a position of trust, we, the jury, find the defendant Letitia Stauch guilty of count number 2, murder in the first degree, child under 12, position of trust. With respect to count number 3, charge of tampering with a deceased human body, we, the jury, find the defendant Letitia Stauch guilty of count number 3, tampering with a deceased human body. With respect to count number 4, charge of tampering with physical evidence, we, the jury, find the defendant Letitia Stauch guilty of count number 4, tampering with physical evidence.
Well, folks, that's all I've got for you today. It's a breakdown of a very sad case. There is no amount of justice that's going to bring back Gannon. And putting her in prison for the rest of her life, I think, is probably the appropriate response. And I hope that whatever evil is inside of her can find some resolution. Letitia Stauch is going to spend the rest of her life in prison. That's where she belongs. That's where people who do evil things belong. Doing evil things doesn't necessarily make a person evil. Being evil is a choice. I hope that when she gets to prison, she is able to make a choice to not be evil and perhaps get some help with the problems that have led her down that path. I will be saying a prayer for her. I hope some of you good people will too. Not to make her life in prison easy, but to make her life in prison productive. Thanks for watching. If you have an opportunity today, go out of your way to be kind to somebody, and I will catch you down here at the beach next time. See ya. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.